She was rejected 3 times in 7 days. 3 men in a single month of March looked at Livia Vance and decided, each in his own way, that she was not enough. But there was a 4th man in that town who never came to that conclusion, because for him, that conclusion simply did not exist, never had existed, and never would exist. Have you ever had one of those weeks where the world seems to conspire to remind you of everything you are not? When one thing after another falls squarely upon your shoulders with the raw precision of someone trying to prove a point. Imagine, then, being a woman in 1924 in a small Midwestern farming town where everybody knows everybody, where lingering looks have long memories, and where gossip travels down unpaved dirt roads faster than any galloping horse. Imagine carrying a week like that all by yourself, with a steady smile and your chin held high, because the only thing you have left entirely intact is your dignity, and you have absolutely no intention of letting anyone take that away from you. This happened in Willow Creek, Indiana, in March of 1924. And what those 3 men didn't know was that, by rejecting Livia Vance, they were, without even realizing what they were doing, paving the way for the most beautiful love story that little town had ever witnessed. But before we get to the 4th man, you need to know Livia. You need to understand who she was before the world tried to convince her that she was nothing. If you are watching this video right now, tell me in the comments where you are tuning in from. It might be a bustling big city, it might be a quiet countryside town just like Willow Creek, or maybe you are sitting right now on the other side of the world. Let me know. And if this story touches your heart in any way, please leave a like, because it truly helps the channel continue bringing these timeless stories to you. Now, come with me, because this one is truly special. Willow Creek was the kind of place that looked breathtakingly beautiful in the month of December, when the winter frosts painted the tall prairie grass white, and the smoke from kitchen stoves drifted lazily above the tin roofs, as if time itself had decided to slow its pace. In the summer, the heat arrived with a sluggish drawl, and the scent of damp earth took over the streets in the early morning. When the men were already heading out to the fields, and the women were just beginning to light their hearths. In the autumn, the weeping willow trees that gave the town its name swayed slowly in the breeze, and their slender leaves fell onto the town square like forgotten little promises. It was a town of about 1,200 souls, give or take. It had a central square with a wooden bandstand that nobody used during the week, but which was packed on Sunday afternoons when Old Man Quincy's band played folk tunes that everyone knew by heart and hummed along to with their eyes closed. Old Man Quincy was 72 years old and had lost 2 fingers on his left hand in a thresher accident decades ago, which made his way of holding the fiddle entirely unique in the world. Yet it had never once hindered the quality of the music that poured from his instrument. The entire town respected Old Man Quincy in a way that went far beyond the music. It was the deep respect for someone who had found a way to do even better, the very thing that destiny had tried to take away from him. There was an apothecary, a general store, a blacksmith, a dressmaker's shop, a clerk's office, 2 taverns that the locals just called saloons, and a little stone church with a bell so old that it creaked heavily before ringing, as if it needed to gather its breath for the effort. There was also the old mill pond on the east side, where children used to fish on the weekends with bamboo poles and a level of patience that the adults had long since lost, and where, on the hot days of July, the water reflected the vast Midwestern sky in a way that made people stop at the water's edge and stare for much longer than they had planned. There was the old wagon trail that cut through the town from north to south, which once a week welcomed the supply wagons from Oak Ridge, bringing provisions, novelties, and every sort of news that the town absorbed with the discreet veracity of people who don't want to seem nosy, but simply cannot pretend they aren't. In Willow Creek, the houses had front porches. It was almost an unwritten rule of law, and on those porches, there was always a wooden bench or a rocking chair, and in that chair there was always someone sitting in the late afternoon, and in the air there was always the rich aroma of freshly percolated coffee, which was, in that town, just as ever-present as the smell of damp fields, and just as fundamental as the air they breathed. Coffee in Willow Creek wasn't just a beverage. It was a ceremony, an open invitation, the way people said, "Stay a while, let's talk," without ever needing to speak those exact words. In this town, everybody had their place, and Livia Vance's place, during the first 26 years of her life, had been a place of deep respect. Her father, the apothecary Arthur Vance, was an educated man in a town where that still meant a great deal. He had attended the seminary in Chicago for 2 years before changing his mind and studying pharmacology, and from this brief stint in theological studies he had kept an elegant penmanship, a profound taste for literature, and the habit of speaking slowly, like a man who carefully weighs every single word before letting it loose. He had married Eleanor Carter, a young woman from a humble family but of rock-solid reputation, and together they had built a dignified life in Willow Creek, smelling of medicinal herbs and printer's ink. Livia was born 2 years after her parents' wedding, and from a very young age she proved to be Arthur's daughter in both her features and her spirit. She had her father's dark brown eyes, large and perhaps a bit too serious for a little girl, and the exact same high forehead he had, the kind that made it seem as though the person was always deep in thought about something, even when they weren't. She had inherited her mother's thick, dark, wavy hair and a steady way of carrying herself, walking as if she always knew exactly where she was going. What neither of them had been able to pass down to her, because it is the kind of thing that simply cannot be taught, was the ability to put people at ease with her sharp intellect. Livia read a lot. She read far more than the other young women in town usually read, and this made her different in a way that was not always interpreted as a virtue. The men who knew her only superficially thought she was arrogant. Those who knew her better understood that it wasn't arrogance at all. It was simply that she viewed the world from an angle that others couldn't see, and sometimes she got so absorbed in that perspective that she forgot to perform the delicate modesty that society demanded of women in 1924. Beatrice Miller had been the very first person to like this about her back in their school days, when they were 12 years old and the teacher had asked a history question that nobody knew the answer to. Livia had raised her hand and delivered an answer so incredibly thorough that the teacher remained silent for an entire second in sheer surprise before offering her praise. The other girls had exchanged sideways glances. Beatrice had turned to Livia and whispered that she was the smartest person she knew, and that she intended to be her best friend forever because she desperately needed someone like that around. Livia had been so taken aback by the frankness that she let out a loud laugh, and Beatrice had laughed right along with her, and it had been exactly like that ever since. 22 years of friendship between the two of them, and neither had ever needed to change herself to fit into the other's life. Beatrice was practical, good-humoured, a homebody, and had a remarkable ability to see the world from the angle of ordinary people, something that Livia, being far more analytical, sometimes missed. Livia was reflective, demanding of herself, and possessed that rare capability to see underlying patterns that Beatrice, who was more intuitive than systematic, sometimes needed someone else to name for her. Together, the two women were better than they were apart, and they both knew it. At 21, Livia had taken over Mrs. Pearl Becker's dressmaking and embroidery shop, as the older woman's eyes were growing too weak for the fine detail that intricate embroidery demanded. Livia had nimble fingers and an aesthetic sense that sprang from the exact same well as her intelligence, that unique capacity to envision what was missing, to imagine what could exist where there was currently nothing but white fabric and thread. Within 2 years, the shop that Mrs. Becker had nearly let die from a lack of patrons had sprung vibrantly back to life. Women from all over the county travelled from afar to commission embroidered pieces that were, according to local gossip, more akin to fine paintings than to needlework. And it was during this time, these years of the shop and thread and needle and fabric, that Tobias Hayes appeared for the very first time. On that particular afternoon in February 1924, a biting north wind was slicing through the crack in the shop's door when Tobias knocked lightly on the wood. The door had been stuck for weeks, the frame having swollen from the dampness of the previous winter in a way that had never quite settled back to normal. Livia had already asked Mr. Abernathy, the town's eldest carpenter, to take a look at it, but the man was in such high demand that he simply never showed up. Tobias was the woodworker, not the carpenter. He made a point to clarify when someone confused the two, not with any arrogance, but with the quiet firmness of a man who knows the difference between things and believes it is important that others know it too. He was 34 years old that February, with light brown hair that already showed a few silver threads at the temples, which he didn't even seem to notice. He had broad hands with thick calluses on the palms, and a height that forced him to dip his head slightly to clear lower door frames. He was not the type of man who walked into a room and loudly claimed all the space. He was more the type who walked in and settled into his corner with such perfect, grounded naturalness that afterward it was nearly impossible to imagine the room without him in it. He mentioned that he had heard from Mr. Abernathy that the shop door was giving her trouble, and that if she didn't mind, he could take a look at it right then and there, as he had his tools out in the wagon. Livia looked up from her embroidery, assessed the man for a brief second, and said, "That would be fine." Tobias worked in total silence for perhaps 20 minutes. He didn't try to force small talk while he worked, which Livia found incredibly restful, because there was a very specific breed of man who used manual labor as an excuse to talk far too much. When he finished, he opened and closed the door 3 times to test it, gave a small, satisfied nod, and let her know the issue was resolved. Livia asked what she owed him. He replied nothing, that it had only been 15 minutes and a piece of sandpaper. She insisted. He gave a half smile, the first smile she saw on his face that day, and said that if she truly wanted to repay him, the next time Beatrice's general store received a shipment of that rich Colombian coffee from Chicago, she could save a tin for him and he'd come by to pay for it. And then he left. Livia stood staring at the door for a moment, the newly fixed door that now opened and closed without a single creak, and thought to herself that there was something curiously satisfying about that man. Then she returned to her embroidery and didn't give it much more thought, because February was overflowing with orders and her mind was occupied with other things. She was, that February, holding her heart out toward Richard Anderson. But that would all come later. First, you have to understand what happened to Livia's father, because that is where everything truly begins. That is where the terrible week in March originated, rolling in, heavy and dark like a Midwestern thunderstorm that you watch approaching from the window, yet still somehow can't prepare yourself for when it finally breaks. Arthur Vance died in August of 1923 on a completely ordinary Thursday while organizing the shelves of his apothecary at the end of the day. His heart simply stopped. There was no warning, no prolonged illness, no chance for goodbyes. It was Mrs. Miller's daughter, who was in the shop buying baking soda, who ran all the way to the Vance home to alert Eleanor. And Eleanor arrived at the apothecary still wearing her kitchen apron, only to find her husband sitting on the floor, leaning against the syrup display, with an expression on his face that she later described as utterly serene, as if he had simply decided to sit down and rest there for a moment. Arthur's death was a massive shock to the entire town, but for Livia and Eleanor it took on an entirely different dimension, because lurking right beneath their grief, there was something else waiting for them. There were the debts. Livia's mourning was the kind that a person keeps hidden. Not because she was cold, but because she carried within her a principle inherited directly from her father. The belief that things which are too large to fit into words sometimes need to be held in silence. She had wept on the night of his funeral, alone in her bedroom, in a way that Eleanor never witnessed, because Livia had waited until her mother was deeply asleep to let it all out. She had cried with her hand clamped firmly over her mouth so as not to make a sound, because the deepest kind of pain, the kind that pulls right from the roots, demands a type of profound privacy that she had always respected in others and fiercely required for herself. Then she stopped. She washed her face. And in the morning she got up and went to help Eleanor receive the mourners, because when a loved one dies, the visitors arrive in overwhelming waves, and you need someone with a level head to organize what the overflowing emotions of others cannot. Arthur Vance was an honest man, but he was also a man who had never quite found the words to tell his family that things were going poorly. The apothecary had been struggling for the last 3 years, ever since a new, larger mercantile in the neighbouring town of Oak Ridge started selling similar remedies for prices that Arthur simply couldn't match. He had taken out loans. He had renegotiated terms. He had tried, in his own quiet way, to fix the mess before it ever reached the point where he would have to burden anyone else with the truth. But death is incredibly impatient, and rarely waits for men to finish arranging their affairs. When the lawyer from the clerk's office came to speak with Eleanor 2 weeks after the funeral, the older woman's eyes widened slowly throughout the entire conversation, wearing the expression of someone who is hearing words in plain English. But the actual meaning is arriving on a severe delay, because the heart requires time to accept what the mind has already deduced. There was a substantial debt with the bank in Chicago. There was a smaller debt with the medical supplier in Cincinnati. There was, in total, a sum that wouldn't be catastrophic for a family with a steady income, but for 2 women on their own, with a failing apothecary and a dressmaking shop as their only concrete source of revenue, it was more than enough to completely alter the weight and standing of the Vance family name in that town. Livia learned of this and remained utterly silent for 3 days. Then she got up, reorganized the ledgers with the help of a meticulous table she drew up herself in a hardbound notebook, and went straight to the bank. She negotiated the repayment terms with an icy calm that astonished even the bank manager, a man who was entirely accustomed to seeing widows faint or weep openly in his office. Livia did neither. She presented what they could afford to pay, proposed a strict timeline, and signed exactly where she was told to sign. When she walked out of the bank, she went directly to the apothecary, unlocked the front doors, and carried on. She was 27 years old that August, and she learned, in the span of a single afternoon, that life has a terrible habit of waiting for you to turn your back before handing you its heaviest surprises. The apothecary was sold 6 months later. There was no feasible way for the 2 women to run both businesses alone, and the dressmaking shop brought in more money while requiring far less capital. With the money from the sale, the debts were paid off almost entirely. What little remained was just enough to keep the house they lived in, a sturdy brick home on Commercial Street with wooden window shutters painted deep green, and to keep them both living with dignity, provided the embroidery shop kept taking orders. And the shop did keep working. Livia was brilliant at what she did, and the townspeople knew it, but the Vance surname had shifted in its resonance. Before, it sounded like unshakable solidity, like an open pharmacy door, like Mr. Arthur, who knew the Latin name of every healing root. Now, it sounded like something significantly more fragile. There was absolutely no dishonor in what had happened. Everybody knew that. But 1924 was 1924, and in a town of 1,200 people, a family's financial fragility had a way of seeping through the walls and dampening whatever stood on the outside. And it was within this precise context that March arrived, and it was in March that the week happened. On a clear Monday morning, with a wind that still bit with winter's chill, Livia received her first rejection. And of the three, this was the one she had anticipated the least, because it involved a man she barely even knew. Dr. Arthur Pendleton had been a widower for 2 years. He was a physician educated in Chicago, and he had arrived in Willow Creek that very year to take over the practice of the town's old doctor, who had retired and moved back to his family estate in Springfield. Dr. Pendleton was 46 years old, possessing the posture of a man who had spent his entire life being respected for his title long before being respected for his character. And he had a habit of observing people with a clinical scrutiny that sometimes crossed the line between medical evaluation and social judgment without him ever realizing it. Livia's cousin, Rose, who had been living in Willow Creek for 2 years since marrying a local merchant, was the one who hatched the idea. Rose was the kind of well-meaning woman who simply couldn't look at an unmarried cousin without feeling an overwhelming urge to fix a problem. Rose knew the wife of Dr. Pendleton's secretary, and the secretary's wife had mentioned, in a mildly conspiratorial tone over afternoon tea, that the doctor was considering formally introducing himself to a woman from a good family, someone who already had her life established and was of a proper age to marry again. Cousin Rose had put Livia's name forward with genuine bubbling enthusiasm. She had praised her intellect, her incredible talent with embroidery, her impeccable character, and then she had waited, brimming with expectation, for the reply. The reply arrived on a Monday morning, delivered by that same secretary's wife, who just happened to drop by Beatrice's general store, the kind of coincidence that in small towns is rarely ever an accident, and communicated, with a suffocating politeness that was almost crueler than outright rudeness would have been, that Dr. Pendleton greatly appreciated the interest, but that he was looking for someone in a more financially established situation. As he had children to raise and required a solid, unshakable foundation. Beatrice Miller listened to this with her arms crossed tightly over the store counter and the dangerously neutral face of a person who is using every ounce of discipline to mask what she actually feels. She was 32 years old, married to Albert Miller, who ran the store with her, had been Livia's closest confidant since school, and possessed the exceedingly rare ability to deliver the truth with grace, which didn't mean the truth hurt any less, only that it hurt with a bit more care. She walked over to the dressmaker's shop herself to tell Livia. She sat down in the chair by the window, waited for the last customer to leave, and then laid it all out, straight, without sugar-coating it, but also without an ounce of cruelty. Livia listened with her eyes locked on her needle and fabric. She kept embroidering for a long moment, exhibiting a concentration that might have looked studied, but which Beatrice knew was simply the way Livia processed heavy things. She needed her hands moving so her mind could work through the knot. Finally, she rested the embroidery in her lap, looked up and said that it was perfectly fine, that she barely knew the man anyway. Beatrice said she knew that, but she still felt she needed to be the one to tell her directly, rather than let the town gossip reach her ears first. Livia told her she had done the right thing, and then, for just a fraction of a second, that unshakable firmness slipped, not enough for any ordinary person to notice, but Beatrice knew her far too well. She saw the subtle way Livia's fingers tightened over the fold of the fabric, gripping it as if she desperately needed something to hold on to keep from falling. A more financially established situation. Livia had worked herself to the bone for an entire year to settle her father's debts. She had opened the shop 6 days a week, had served her patrons with the exact same meticulous care as always, had negotiated, planned, and sacrificed. And a man she had never even shared a cup of coffee with had decided from afar that all of it was insufficient. She took a slow, deep breath, lifted her embroidery back up, and told Beatrice that she'd love a slice of that peach cobbler she had baked yesterday, if there was any left over. Beatrice went to fetch the cobbler and didn't speak another word about Dr. Arthur Pendleton that day. But as she walked out of the shop, strolling slowly down Commercial Street back toward the general store, she couldn't stop thinking about the exact second Livia's fingers had clutched the fabric. And she felt something she couldn't quite put a name to, a mixture of burning anger, deep sorrow, and something that felt awfully like a dark premonition. On Wednesday of that exact same week, the second rejection arrived. Richard Anderson had been Livia's fiancé for 14 months. They had met at the Midsummer Harvest Festival 2 years prior, when Richard had returned from the State College, where he had been studying agricultural management to help his father run the family's sprawling farm. He was handsome in a way he was entirely aware of, possessing the easy charm of a man who grew up knowing he was favored and had learned to wield it naturally. He had that smooth way with people that belongs exclusively to those who have never had to work terribly hard to win anyone over, because the world had always handed them things just a little bit easier. Their engagement had been announced in September of 1922, on a sunny Sunday afternoon at the town square gazebo, exactly the way things were done in Willow Creek, with both families present, Reverend Evans offering a blessing and the whole town drinking cold lemonade afterward. Livia had arrived at that day with her heart swelling with a kind of joy that actually surprised her, because she was not a woman prone to emotional excess, and this vast, warm happiness had been a wonderful novelty. For the first 8 months, the engagement was exactly what it was supposed to be. Richard came to call on Sundays, bringing sweets and sitting in the parlour to talk with Eleanor present, just as decency dictated. Sometimes he would meet her in the square and they would walk together to the haberdashery. He was attentive, he had a lovely sense of humour. And Livia had begun to construct, with that powerful ability she had to vividly imagine what did not yet exist, a vision of their future that she liked very, very much. There were moments when it had felt genuinely wonderful to be with him. A winter afternoon, when they had stood on the porch, watching the rain sweep in over the fields with that sudden Midwestern speed, hitting like a solid grey wall on the horizon and soaking you 10 minutes later. And he had stood quietly beside her watching the storm, feeling no need to fill the silence with idle chatter. A birthday party where he had danced with her, displaying that effortless physical grace that men raised working the land sometimes possess, totally natural and without affectation. The day she had suffered a blinding migraine, and he had cancelled their Sunday plans without a single complaint, sending over a jar of raspberry preserves with a 3-line note that carried, she had thought, a remarkably honest tenderness. Those moments were real. She hadn't invented them. But they were not the whole picture, and over the last 4 months those moments had grown rarer, spaced further apart, as if the tide between them had simply gone out without either of them being able to pinpoint the exact moment the water receded. He came around less often. When he did, he was quiet in a way that wasn't peacefulness, it was distance. Livia had noticed, had asked him once if everything was all right, had received a vague answer that was technically a yes but emotionally a no, and so she had waited, giving him the space to explain himself whenever he was ready. He never got ready. On Wednesday of that awful week in March, Richard arrived at the dressmaker's shop in the late afternoon, just as the last customers had hurried home and Livia was closing the shutters. He walked in, holding his hat in his hands, which, she would realize much later, had been the ultimate tell. Richard was the sort of man who entered a room with his hat firmly on his head and only removed it once he was settled, like a man who suddenly needed an object to wring in his hands to get through what he had to do. He said they needed to talk. Livia pointed to the chair. He sat on the very edge of it, not leaning back, sitting exactly like a man preparing to bolt for the door. What followed was delivered with the delicate phrasing of a man trained to be polite, paired with the utter cowardice of a man who had failed to be honest when there was still time for honesty to do any good. He said he had been doing a lot of thinking. He said she was a woman he deeply admired, but that the circumstances had drastically changed. That with the sudden death of her father, the mounting debts, and the sale of the apothecary, his family had grown terribly concerned about the solidity of their future. That his father had sat him down for a long, hard talk. That he himself had come to realize that deep down, they were perhaps just very different people. Livia listened to all of this standing up, her back pressed against the closed window, her arms crossed, her eyes locked dead onto his. She didn't say a single word while he spoke. When he finally trailed off, there was a heavy moment of absolute silence, where the only sound was the wind howling outside and a hound dog barking 2 streets over. Then she spoke. With a voice so chillingly level that it startled them both, she told him that she understood perfectly, that he could put his mind at ease, and that there was nothing left to do but wish him well. Richard looked momentarily stunned by her total lack of a scene, as if a small, selfish part of him had actively hoped for tears or bitter recriminations so that he could more easily justify his own betrayal to himself. But Livia refused to give him that satisfaction. He walked out. She stood there, staring at the door that had clicked shut behind him with practiced ease, the very door Tobias had fixed just 3 weeks earlier, and she felt the crushing weight of a highly specific kind of loneliness. It wasn't the loneliness of being physically alone, but the profound isolation of realizing that someone you believed was yours had only ever been passing through, and you simply hadn't possessed the vision to see it in time. The hardest part wasn't the loss of the man himself. It was the internal restructuring. Because when Richard had walked in that afternoon with his hat in his hand and walked out 20 minutes later with their engagement severed, Livia had painfully realized that a considerable portion of what she had felt for him over the last several months wasn't actually love anymore. It was merely habit, expectation, and the beautiful narrative she had spun in her own mind about how their future was going to be. And this stark discovery had layered a strange, bitter film over her grief, because she no longer knew if she was mourning the actual relationship she had lost, or the beautiful phantom of what she had imagined it could be. There was something incredibly specific and incredibly revealing about that. She was a woman capable of vividly imagining what did not exist. She had built grand, elaborate versions of a future with Richard inside her own head that were far richer than anything that actually existed between them in reality. And the question that lingered, uncomfortable yet undeniably useful, was how many times had she done exactly this? How often had she substituted the real for the imagined without ever realizing she had made the trade? It was 10:30 at night when she finally arrived at this question, lying in bed staring up at the dark wooden ceiling beams, and she sat with it for a long while before finally letting sleep take her. When Livia had walked into the house earlier that evening wearing the exact same expression she had worn as a stubborn child, her eyes a shade darker than usual, her chin tilted a millimeter higher, as if her entire body had sworn a blood oath not to yield a single inch of ground to the pain, Eleanor had taken one look at her daughter and gone straight to the kitchen. She brewed a fresh pot of coffee, brought out 2 mugs, and sat down right beside Livia on the wooden porch swing that the encroaching autumn was already painting with a bitter chill. Livia told her. Eleanor listened in total silence, which was the absolute hardest thing in the world for her to do, because Eleanor was a woman of action. She wanted to fix, to mend, to solve, and when faced with things that could not be fixed, remaining silent required a monumental physical effort. When Livia finished speaking, Eleanor said simply that Richard Anderson had lost far more than he could ever comprehend. Livia said she knew that. And the 2 women sat there drinking hot coffee in the freezing cold of the porch, not saying another word for a very long time, watching the sky slowly turn pitch black, while the pine trees at the end of the road swayed gently in the dark. 2 days later, the third rejection arrived, and this one was entirely different from the other two. This one had a history buried inside of it. Ernest Sullivan was 33 years old, the proud owner of the largest mercantile in town, the big brick building that anchored the corner of the town square and the old wagon trail. He had a way of moving through the world with a genuine, effortless ease that made his presence incredibly pleasant in any room he walked into. He wasn't an extraordinarily handsome man, but he possessed a smile that always arrived a fraction of a second earlier than you expected it to, as if he were perpetually just a little more delighted by life than the circumstances actually warranted, and that sheer warmth made everyone around him feel a little more delighted too. Livia had started noticing Ernest 2 years ago in a way she rarely ever noticed men. There was something about him that she found deeply authentic, a kind of good humor that was neither a performance nor a shallow facade, but a real, rooted disposition to genuinely like people and things. He always stopped to chat whenever they crossed paths, asking about her embroidery work with real interest, making thoughtful comments about the books she carried under her arm, and recalling tiny details from past conversations that astonished her. She had hoarded these brief conversations the way a person hoards tiny, beautiful trinkets in a locked drawer, without examining them too closely, just keeping them safe. Out of the scattered fragments of these interactions, she had built an image of Ernest inside her mind that was perhaps far more intricate than the man himself would even recognize. It contained the heavy projection of everything she had imagined could possibly exist between them if the circumstances were different, if she had been more forward, if he had ever given her a single concrete sign. And he had given signs, she sometimes tried to tell herself, or at least it had seemed like he had. The deliberate way he sought out her company at town socials, how he lingered longer talking to her than to anyone else, how sometimes, right in the middle of a completely unrelated conversation, he would look at her in a way she had desperately interpreted as meaning more. But interpretation is precisely the fatal flaw of silence. You can mold it into absolutely anything you want. You can build an entire sweeping romance inside a mundane conversation about the autumn corn harvest if you want it badly enough, and Livia had wanted it. Not even Beatrice, her dearest confidant, knew. It was one of those fragile affections she kept buried so deep inside herself, terrified that exposing it to the light would ruin it, as if saying his name out loud meant running the risk that the world might snatch it away before she was entirely ready. And then came Friday. It was late morning when Beatrice pushed open the door to the shop wearing an expression Livia had never ever seen on her face before. It wasn't exactly sadness. It was the haunted look of someone who's about to deliver a message they never asked to carry, and who would give almost anything to not be carrying it. She said she had heard the news down at the mercantile that morning when she went to pick up a sack of flour, that Ernest had arrived with the father of a young woman named Leonora Walker, the daughter of a wealthy cattleman from Oak Ridge, that they had officially finalized the courtship and engagement, that the formal announcement was scheduled for Sunday morning services, but that all of Willow Creek already knew before Friday lunch. Livia went absolutely still for a long, suspended moment. The needle froze in her hand. The embroidery rested dead in her lap, her eyes locked onto an indeterminate spot on the plaster wall in front of her. Beatrice stood awkwardly near the door, not knowing what on earth to do with her own hands. The situation with Ernest was vastly different from the other two rejections, and Beatrice knew it, even without knowing the secret Livia had never confessed. She knew it because she knew Livia better than anyone. She knew it from the subtle way her friend's smile shifted whenever the conversation drifted near Ernest's name, from that extra second of hyper-awareness when he walked into a room they were in, from the way she would sometimes casually mention things he had said with a level of granular detail that was anything but casual. Ernest had never rejected Livia. Ernest didn't even know there was anything to reject, because Livia had never spoken a word of it, had never given him a wide enough opening to even suspect it. But that somehow made the whole thing infinitely harder to swallow, because mixed in with the sharp pain was the impossible, agonizing math, trying to calculate exactly how much of it had ever been possible, how much of it had been pure fantasy, and what shred of truth had actually existed in that quiet space between them where she had carefully authored a story he had never even read. She told Beatrice thank you for coming to tell her. She said it with a terrifyingly calm voice. Beatrice asked if she was all right. Livia said she was. And Beatrice, who knew perfectly well that she wasn't, but who also knew that Livia desperately needed this exact moment to pull herself together, just said, "All right, okay. Send word if you need anything," and let herself out. When the door clicked shut, Livia set her embroidery down on the work table, walked over to the back window that looked out over the small yard where an old, gnarled apple tree had stood for 20 years, and just stood there staring at the tree without seeing a single thing. The wind rustled the green leaves. A sparrow landed on a branch and flew away a second later, as if it had suddenly changed its mind. What had truly caught her off guard, she began to realize as she stared blindly at the apple tree, wasn't the rejection itself, which involved a man she barely knew and for whom she felt nothing of real substance in the case of the doctor. It was the phrasing. A more financially established situation. As if she were a parcel of land being appraised for purchase, as if there was a ledger somewhere with all her assets neatly listed, and her final balance had simply failed to meet the minimum required bid. There wasn't a single question in that brutal formulation about who she was, not a shred of curiosity about what she thought, or dreamed, or understood about the world. There was only a number, and her number had been deemed insufficient. She stood there staring at the tree for a while longer, and then she said to herself, out loud in the empty room, that Dr. Pendleton knew absolutely nothing about her, and that the conclusion of a man who knows nothing about you is not a conclusion about you at all. It is a conclusion about him. It took a few agonizing days for that brilliant formulation to sink from the logical level of her brain down to the bruised level of her chest and actually start to feel true. But it took root, and when the second rejection hit her, she already had that tiny, hard stone of certainty installed somewhere deep inside her, insufficient to hold back the entire flood, but solid enough that she didn't completely wash away. The esteemed doctor who dismissed her without even taking the time to know her, the fiancé who bolted the second her family name ceased to offer a comfortable cushion, and the man for whom she had harbored a silent, burning affection for 2 years, who had chosen someone else without ever even knowing there was a choice to be made. Livia stood there looking at the apple tree and thought, with a clinical detachment that surprised even her, that there was something highly specific and incredibly cruel about the way the universe had decided to organize this particular week. As if someone up above had decided to present her in the span of 7 short days, with 3 entirely different variations of the exact same question. And the question was this: do you truly believe you are enough? She didn't answer that question that day. She simply closed the shutters, put the unfinished embroidery away in the heavy wooden drawer, blew out the kerosene lamp, locked the shop door, and walked home slowly down Commercial Street. Her chin at the exact same defiant angle as always, her eyes looking straight ahead, offering a polite nod to the folks who tipped their hats to her. That night, lying in bed with the heavy timber ceiling above her and the Midwestern wind rattling the window panes, Livia lay awake for a very long time. She did not cry. She simply lay there thinking, with that relentless mind of hers that refused to ever shut off, about everything that had transpired over the last 7 days. And she arrived, somewhere around 2 in the morning, at a harsh conclusion that brought her absolutely no immediate comfort, but which lodged itself inside her like a grain of sand inside an oyster, painfully uncomfortable, yet undeniably present. All three of them had, each in his own specific way, run the exact same calculation. They had looked at her, tallied up what she possessed, subtracted what she lacked, and arrived at a final sum that they deemed insufficient. And the core tragedy of this calculation wasn't that these men were inherently evil. The tragedy was that she had allowed their arithmetic to be the definitive measure of her worth. She stared at the ceiling for a while, analyzing each of the three men. Dr. Pendleton, who hadn't even bothered to properly introduce himself before crossing her off a list. Richard, who had known her and claimed to love her in the bountiful times, only to run for the hills the second the ledger tipped into the red. Ernest, who had never had the slightest clue how she felt, and to whom she had been nothing more than a delightful presence at town socials, while he built a concrete future with another woman in a corner of his life she had never managed to access. Three completely different stories, three identical endings. And in every single one of them, there was a version of Livia who had merely waited, guarded, imagined, constructed elaborate fantasies, without ever speaking up, without ever exposing herself, without ever daring to put her own voice between herself and the terrifying possibility of a no. In all three stories, she had been far more of a spectator than the protagonist of her own heart. And there was a highly specific kind of agony in that realization, not the pain of being rejected, but the searing pain of realizing exactly how much she had actively contributed to her own silencing. This was the revelation that met her at 2 in the morning, shocking her with its icy, analytical clarity, as if her sheer exhaustion had finally lowered her defenses enough for the raw truth to kick the door down without asking permission. There was a part of her, a deeply ingrained part, that had learned very early on that it was infinitely better to be desired than to actively desire, that being chosen was infinitely safer than having the courage to choose, that rejection stings slightly less when you can pretend you never really wanted the thing in the first place. And for years she had operated entirely in this defensive mode, locking her true affections deep inside, desperately waiting for external signs, and measuring her own temperature strictly by the thermometers of others. This had to stop. She didn't know exactly how to make it stop yet. Not at 2 in the morning on a freezing Friday in March with the wind howling against the glass. But she knew, with that bone-dry certainty that sometimes arrives when a person is simply too exhausted to keep lying to themselves, that the only question that actually mattered wasn't whether she was enough for other people. It was whether she was enough for herself. It took her a while to fully comprehend what she meant by that. But the seed had been planted, pushed deep into the frozen soil of that March night, quietly waiting for the right season to finally start growing. So, my dear listeners of the Tales of Yesteryear channel, if this story is making your heart beat just a little bit differently, it isn't a coincidence. Leave a like and stay with me, because this is where the story truly begins to bloom. The following week, Livia woke up on Monday with the stark clarity of a woman who has spent the entire weekend digesting a terrible, heavy thing and has come out on the other side with an empty stomach but a fiercely sharp mind. She sat on the porch drinking coffee with Eleanor, the air biting sharper now as April loomed, and answered her mother's careful questions about how she was feeling with the blunt honesty that their relationship permitted. A purely practical honesty, entirely devoid of theatricality. She said she was sad, but that she was whole. Eleanor nodded with that specific maternal way of accepting her daughter's answers, even when her heart ached for more. The weeks that followed were a period of retreat, not the dramatic kind. You wouldn't find Livia weeping in bed with the curtains drawn while the town murmured outside her window. It was a far more subtle withdrawal, almost imperceptible if you didn't know her exceptionally well. She kept opening the shop every single morning, kept attending to her patrons, kept producing intricate embroidery that remained the absolute finest in the county. But she politely declined invitations to the Sunday bandstand concerts. She went less frequently to the mercantile, less to the new apothecary, less to any public place where she might run into people who had undoubtedly heard some twisted version of what had transpired. Beatrice noticed. Of course Beatrice noticed. She dropped by the shop at least twice a week, which was normal, but now she stayed much longer. She brought the most entertaining tidbits from the general store, spinning town gossip into delightful social chronicles with her trademark flair. She brought over fresh peach cobbler whenever she baked it, knowing it had been Livia's favorite comfort since they were little girls. And she vehemently refused to mention a single word about the three men, which was the absolute kindest thing she could possibly do, because true kindness is often knowing exactly what not to say. It was during one of Beatrice's visits, on a drizzly April afternoon that smelled heavily of wet earth and soaked pine needles, that Tobias Hayes reappeared. He knocked on the door frame with the exact same demeanor as before, not demanding entry, simply announcing his presence. Livia called out for him to come in, and he stepped inside, hat in his hands. He looked at the two women, offered a quiet, polite good afternoon, and mentioned that he had stopped by Beatrice's store earlier, and Albert had mentioned that the back shutters of Livia's shop had a broken slat. He figured, since he was passing by anyway, he could take a quick look. Livia said yes, of course, make yourself at home, it's the shutter by the apple tree window. He walked over, assessed the damage, noted that he had the right wood in his wagon, and returned 5 minutes later with exactly what he needed. Beatrice sat watching the large man work with a laser-focused attention that she poorly attempted to disguise by staring at Livia's embroidery hoop, a ruse Livia knew her far too well to fall for. When Tobias finished and took his leave, offering the same discreet nod of thanks and the same gentle refusal to charge her anything of substance, Beatrice waited until the heavy sound of his boots faded down the boardwalk. Then she slowly turned her face toward Livia, wearing an expression Livia did not appreciate one bit. Beatrice stated, employing the tone of a woman making an entirely neutral clinical observation, that Tobias Hayes was an exceptionally attentive man. Livia replied that he was helpful, yes, and that he did his job very well. Beatrice countered that this was absolutely not what she had said. Livia said she knew perfectly well it wasn't, and promptly changed the subject. But the observation hung in the air, and over the following weeks, Livia began to actively notice what she had probably been passively absorbing for months, without ever putting a name to it. Tobias appeared. Not in an intrusive manner, not in a way that drew the idle gossip of the town, or placed her in any awkward position. He just appeared, the way certain rare people do, with a consistency so grounded and natural that it sometimes takes you a while to realize there's a deliberate pattern to it. At the Saturday farmers' market, he was there. He wouldn't march right up to her. He wouldn't hover. But inevitably, at some point during the busy morning, their paths would cross, and he would tip his hat with that quiet half-smile that demanded absolutely nothing in return. It simply acknowledged that she existed in the world. At Sunday church services, he sat 3 pews behind her. Not right beside her, but positioned perfectly at the angle where, if she discreetly turned her head, he was there, paying attention to the reverend's sermon with the concentrated seriousness of a man who takes life seriously. When a torrential downpour hit just as she was locking up the shop, he had miraculously materialized with a large umbrella, mentioning casually that he was headed in the exact same direction and could walk her to the corner if she didn't mind the company. She did not mind. These isolated incidents, taken on their own, meant nothing in particular. Willow Creek was a small town, and folks naturally bumped into one another. It was practically impossible not to. But there was a distinctly different quality to her interactions with Tobias compared to her interactions with any other man in town. And Livia, who was far too intelligent to miss the obvious and far too stubborn to easily admit it, was finding it increasingly impossible to ignore this difference. The difference was this: Tobias never calculated. Every other man she knew, even the incredibly well-meaning ones, even the genuinely kind ones, had at some fleeting moment a millisecond of appraisal in their eyes. A rapid, involuntary sweep that tallied the sums and subtracted the deficits before deciding exactly how to approach her. Livia had learned to spot this look during the comfortable years of her youth, and she saw it even more clearly during the leaner years. The look in a man's eyes was notably different when the Vance surname meant a booming pharmacy versus when it meant quietly settled debts. She had learned to swallow it and live with it, because that was simply the way the world turned, and she was a highly practical woman. Tobias did not possess that look. There was not a single fraction of a second of arithmetic in his eyes. When he looked at her, it was purely the gaze of a man looking at a woman and deciding that she, in and of herself, was profoundly interesting. Period. As if the rest of the ledger simply didn't exist, or had never even factored into the equation. This bothered her in a highly specific way, not in an unpleasant way, but in the frustrating way things bother you when you have painstakingly arranged your entire world into a neat, defensive order, and one single element refuses to stay in the neat little box you shoved it into. Over the months since March, Livia had constructed a brilliantly engineered fortress wall. It wasn't an obvious wall. It wasn't built of rudeness or icy glares. It was a carefully calibrated distance, a reduction of her attention to the bare minimum required by politeness, a fierce internal vow to never again build elaborate castles in the sky before having concrete proof that the ground was solid. She had silently promised herself that she was done being the girl who spun sweeping romances out of idle chatter about the corn harvest. And then Tobias would appear, holding a piece of sandpaper or a woodworking tool or a book, wearing that infuriatingly steady half-smile. And he didn't ask her to build a single thing. He didn't demand any frantic interpretation. He was just there, with his quiet, towering presence, being exactly who he was, nothing more and nothing less. And that, paradoxically, was vastly more terrifying to handle than a man who demanded to be deciphered, because you simply do not know what on earth to do with a person who doesn't need you to invent them. It was on a mild afternoon in May that they had their first real proper conversation. Livia was in the shop with the front door propped open because the day had warmed up beautifully. One of those glorious Midwestern spring days where the sun forgets it's supposed to set and lingers just a little bit longer. She was hunched over an intricate embroidery piece commissioned by Mrs. Geraldine, the town clerk's wife. It was a delicate tapestry of wildflowers rendered in brilliant blue and spun gold silk thread, a piece that demanded grueling precision and the absolute silence that deep concentration requires. Tobias strolled past on the boardwalk. She heard the heavy, measured cadence of his boots, a sound she had unconsciously learned to recognize. The steady footfall of a man who walks with his feet firmly planted on the earth without ever dragging his heels, and she looked up purely out of reflex. He was walking by, glanced inside, stopped dead when he saw her looking, and politely asked if he was interrupting her work. She said no, she was just finishing a stitch. He leaned against the doorframe and noted that the embroidery was stunning, that the wildflowers looked entirely real. She thanked him, mentioning it was a piece for Mrs. Geraldine. He nodded, saying, "Ah, the clerk's wife, a woman of very fine taste." And then, instead of tipping his hat and continuing on his way, he remained standing on the threshold for a long moment. With that remarkable naturalness he possessed, the ability to never create an ounce of awkwardness in any situation, he casually asked if she was reading anything interesting at the moment. Livia blinked once, genuinely surprised by the pivot, and told him she was halfway through a collection of short stories by O. Henry that had just arrived on the train from Chicago. Tobias mentioned that he knew the name, that he had read one of his stories in an old newspaper he kept at the house, and that he found the man to be a fiercely sharp observer, the kind of writer who notices all the tiny, beautiful things that everybody else walks right past. Livia's face lit up, and she said that was exactly it, that it was her absolute favorite thing about his writing, his incredible capacity to pay deep attention to the smallest details of ordinary life and prove that they aren't actually small at all. Tobias looked at her for a long second with an expression she couldn't quite put a name to. Then, his voice low and steady, he said that was an incredibly rare gift, both in writers and in everyday people. And then he tipped his hat and walked away. Livia sat frozen, staring blindly at her embroidery hoop for a long time after he disappeared, her nimble fingers entirely still, her needle forgotten mid-stitch. Finally, she gave her head a tiny shake, as if physically swatting away a persistent fly, and forced herself back to work. Over the coming weeks, those doorway conversations evolved into a quiet habit that neither of them ever formally agreed to. They just happened when they happened, totally devoid of schedules or heavy expectations. Sometimes he would walk past and they wouldn't stop to talk at all, merely exchanging a polite "good morning." Other times the conversation would effortlessly stretch to 15 or 20 minutes, weaving through topics that ranged from the delightfully trivial to the unexpectedly profound, without ever feeling the jarring shift in gears. He was far more well-read than Livia had ever anticipated from a town woodworker, not in the arrogant way of a man who hoards books to prove he is smart, but in the earnest way of a man who harbors deep questions about the world and understands that books sometimes offer partial answers to hold you over until the real ones arrive. There was one afternoon where he casually mentioned a new house being framed on the east side of town. He noted that they were laying a foundation with a grade of brick he considered woefully inferior, and he launched into a detailed explanation about the structural integrity of kiln-fired clay. It revealed a depth of knowledge about raw materials so intricate that Livia found herself genuinely fascinated, asking sharp questions that he answered with the endless patience of a man who truly loves explaining his craft to someone who actually wants to learn. There was something profoundly healing in that exchange, a feeling she had never once experienced with any of the other three men. It was the sudden, breathtaking realization that her sharp intellect wasn't a problem that needed to be carefully managed or hidden away. It was a deeply welcome, cherished presence in the conversation. On another, longer afternoon, with the Midwestern sky bleeding into brilliant strokes of orange and bruised purple at the end of the street, he told her a little about his father. Not a lot, and not in a heavy way that felt like a tragic confession or a burden he was demanding she carry. Just enough for her to understand that he had been raised by a stern man of very few words, a man who taught life lessons through calloused hands rather than speeches. He told her how he had learned the woodworking trade strictly by watching for years before he was ever allowed to touch the timber, and how that specific method of learning, understanding the grain with the eye long before touching it with the hand, had entirely shaped the way he viewed the world. Livia listened with that fierce, piercing attention she reserved only for things she deemed utterly authentic. When he finished, she quietly noted that she believed a person's true history is always perfectly reflected in the labor they choose, and that his woodwork spoke volumes about exactly the kind of man he was. He went completely silent for a second, his eyes locked on hers, and then softly replied that she had a remarkable way of saying things that made the most complex truths sound beautifully simple. She didn't formulate a reply to that, but she locked the memory away in her vault. During one of these doorway chats, he asked what it had been like growing up with a father who was a master apothecary and botanist, whether she had picked up any deep knowledge of medicinal roots and herbs. Livia let out a sudden bright laugh, which startled them both, because she so rarely laughed out of pure surprise. She confessed that she knew how to brew a specific fever-breaking tea that her father absolutely swore was vastly superior to any manufactured tonic sitting on his shelves. Tobias turned deadly serious and agreed, stating that the ancestral knowledge of the Earth's plants was one of the greatest tragedies progress was currently threatening to pave right over. She looked at him and said she felt the exact same way. It was during one of these very conversations that he showed up one day holding a book in his large hand, a slim volume bound in worn dark leather, which he extended to her without an ounce of ceremony, simply stating that he had just finished it and had a strong feeling she might appreciate it. It was a collection of stories by Sherwood Anderson, an author Livia hadn't read before. But within the first 3 pages that very night, she was completely captivated. There was a raw, aching quality to his observation of the American heartland, the ordinary folks, the sweeping fields, the quiet desperation of small-town customs that felt as though it had been penned by someone who paid the exact same reverence to the tiny things that both she and Tobias valued so highly. And tucked away in the middle of the volume, quiet and almost totally hidden among the heavier tales, was a simple, breathtaking love story. She read it twice before moving on, struck by a quality of pure tenderness that touched a bruised place inside her she hadn't realized was still tender. She went to return the book a week later, armed with a fiercely formulated opinion on every single story, and the conversation that erupted was the longest they had shared to date. Easily 40 minutes standing on the threshold, the sun dipping low and the sharp scent of wood smoke drifting on the cooling evening air. When he finally tipped his hat and said he'd better be getting on, because it was getting late, she was struck by the acute sensation that the conversation had been interrupted right in the middle, that there were 100 more things waiting to be said. And the realization that she wanted to say them was a terrifying new development. She hadn't quite decided yet if this new feeling was a comfort or a threat. Beatrice, who had casually strolled down the opposite side of the street, entirely unnoticed by the two of them, walked back into her mercantile wearing a grin so wide that Albert paused his sweeping to ask what good news she had heard. She just waved a hand and said, "Oh, nothing at all, Al. Don't you worry about it." The month of June rolled in, bringing the town festival with it. Every single year in June, Willow Creek threw what they proudly called the Midsummer Harvest Festival. It was, in essence, a massive communal picnic taking over the entire town square, featuring food tents, live fiddle music, horseshoe tournaments, and enough sweet tea and distractions to keep the entire county in a state of euphoric goodwill for at least a solid 3 days. It was the most beloved event of the year, likely because it didn't belong to any specific church, so nobody felt obligated to enforce strict sobriety. Livia had seriously considered staying home. She had reasoned for a fleeting moment that May and the beginning of June had been wonderful, but fragile. There was a highly comfortable, safe predictability in the quiet walls of her shop, in her books, and in the doorway conversations. She had absolutely no desire to risk shattering that fragile peace by stepping into a crowded town square where Richard Anderson would undoubtedly be parading around, where Dr. Pendleton would be casting his clinical judgments, and where Ernest Sullivan would certainly be strolling arm in arm with Leonora Walker. Beatrice absolutely refused to accept this logic. She barged into Livia's house on Saturday afternoon, wearing the face of a general who did not come to negotiate surrender terms. She declared that they were going together, that she would personally drag Livia out of bed on Sunday morning, that Eleanor had already enthusiastically endorsed the plan, and that life simply does not pause to wait until you feel like showing up for it. Sometimes you have to show up long before the courage actually arrives. Livia glared and told Beatrice she was absolutely exasperating. Beatrice smiled sweetly, said she was well aware, and reminded Livia that this was precisely why they were best friends. On Sunday morning, the two women walked to the square together. The day had dawned magnificently, one of those crystal-clear Midwestern June days where the morning air is still biting and crisp, but the bright white sun illuminates the world with a glorious, sharp clarity. The town square was draped in colourful bunting, and the food tents were already billowing thick, mouth-watering smoke, carrying the heavy scent of slow-roasted beef, fresh-baked pies, and roasted sweet corn that you could smell from 3 streets away. Livia wore a finely tailored dove-grey wool coat over a deep navy-blue dress, her dark hair pinned elegantly back with a carved wooden comb her father had bought for her in Chicago years ago. She looked stunning in a way she hadn't bothered to look for a very long time, and her face carried a decidedly different expression than it had in the dark weeks of March. It was as if the months of quiet doorway conversations, shared books and evening coffee on the porch with her mother had slowly deposited a brand new layer of unshakable armor over her soul. The morning passed beautifully. She and Beatrice strolled among the booths, ate hot roasted corn, chatted pleasantly with acquaintances, and ran into Reverend Evans, who was always a delight because he harbored a surprisingly wicked sense of humor for a man of the cloth. Albert tagged along for a while before being inevitably swallowed up by a loud group of farmers fiercely debating the price of cattle. And then, as was entirely inevitable in a town of that size, the 3 ghosts appeared. Richard Anderson was the first. He was standing with a group of old college buddies near the bandstand. When their eyes locked for a split second, Livia braced herself for the familiar, agonizing sting. But the phantom pain passed much faster than she anticipated, like a sudden sharp draft of cold wind that makes you shiver once, and then you immediately forget it because you're already thinking about the warm fire inside. He offered a stiff, awkward wave. She nodded politely in return, and she kept right on walking. Dr. Pendleton was hovering near the apothecary's booth, deep in conversation with the young pharmacist who had bought out her father's old shop. He greeted her with a stiff, formal inclination of his head as she walked past, maintaining the rigid composure of a man who possesses zero self-awareness that he has ever done anything requiring an apology. Livia returned the exact same frigid, formal nod, matching his composure blow for blow, and glided right past him. Ernest Sullivan was lingering near the barbecue pits, and yes, he had Leonora Walker securely on his arm. She was a lovely girl with soft features and a genuinely sweet expression, looking absolutely thrilled to be exactly where she was. Livia let her eyes rest on the couple for a lingering second, scanning her own heart the way a doctor probes a wound, searching for the source of the bleeding. There was a dull ache, a tiny twinge, a faint echo that felt far more like the memory of a broken heart rather than an actively breaking one. She took a slow, deep breath, realizing with quiet awe that this must be exactly what true healing feels like. Not the magical total erasure of the scar, but the newfound strength to look the scar dead in the eye without feeling the desperate urge to turn and run. And it was in that exact moment of triumph that she spotted Tobias. He was standing entirely by himself near one of the long wooden picnic tables the town council hauled out for the festival, holding a tin plate of food. He was watching the chaotic swirl of the festival with that signature expression of quiet, attentive peace, as if the entire world were a fascinating play being put on just for him, and he had nowhere else to be. The moment his eyes found hers across the crowded grass, his face shifted in that incredibly subtle way, that devastatingly handsome half-smile arriving just a second before she expected it. She walked straight toward him, without Beatrice needing to shove her forward an inch. a fact that caused Beatrice, watching from afar, to poorly disguise a massive, deeply satisfied grin. Tobias noted that the roasted corn was exceptionally good this year. Livia agreed, mentioning she had just finished an ear near the main tent. He pointed out that Albert seemed to be thoroughly enjoying himself arguing with the cattleman over by the oak trees. She laughed and said that whenever Albert got roped into that crowd, he lost all concept of space and time. Tobias nodded slowly, his eyes crinkling, and said he completely understood that feeling, that there were simply some things and some people that just naturally pulled you entirely into their orbit. They stood near the edge of the picnic tables and talked for easily half an hour, cocooned in their own world, while the loud, joyful chaos of the town festival swirled wildly around them. It was a conversation about absolutely nothing of grand importance, yet simultaneously about everything that mattered. It possessed that rare magnetic flow that only exists when the groundwork between two people has already been painstakingly laid, when a secret private language has already been built, brick by brick, conversation by conversation. At some point during their talk, a young girl sprinting blindly through the crowd crashed hard into Livia's shoulder. Livia stumbled, taking a quick step sideways to catch her balance, and ended up standing significantly closer to Tobias than polite society dictated. He did not step back to correct the distance. She did not step away either. They remained standing exactly like that for a long, suspended second that may or may not have been purely accidental, and absolutely neither of them breathed a word about it. When Beatrice finally strolled over to officially wrangle Livia for lunch, she approached slowly enough to register exactly what she was seeing. The two of them standing solidly in each other's space, the effortless, flowing ease between them. And then she deliberately sped up her pace so as not to be glaringly obvious about her espionage. Later that afternoon, as they walked home down the dusty road, Beatrice stated, projecting all the sterile neutrality she could muster, that Tobias Hayes had certainly monopolized Livia's time for quite a while at the festival. Livia replied smoothly that yes, they were practically neighbors on Commercial Street, so it was perfectly natural. Beatrice let out a long, drawn-out, Livia snapped, demanding to know what exactly meant. Beatrice smiled like a cat who had cornered a canary, and said it merely meant she had noticed. Livia laughed in a distinctly different way when she was talking to him. Lighter, easier, less heavily armored. "You know what I mean," Beatrice added. Livia firmly stated that she absolutely did not know what she meant. Beatrice patted her arm and said, "That's perfectly fine, honey. You'll figure it out when it's time." Livia went home and spent far, far too much time analyzing Beatrice's in the dark. The weeks that followed through late June and July carried a tangibly different energy than the months before. The heavy, self-imposed isolation had melted away without Livia even realizing the exact day the thaw began, much like the great Midwestern spring thaws that happen so gradually you can't tell if the ice broke yesterday or a week ago. She returned to the bandstand concerts on Sundays. She went back to the Mercantile without strategically planning her trips to avoid the crowds. She started happily accepting Beatrice's invitations to sit in the back room of the store and drink coffee after closing time, and she kept talking to Tobias from the doorway. On one particularly golden July afternoon, he arrived carrying a second book. This time, before handing it over, he mentioned that he had marked a specific page with a slip of paper. He told her there was a paragraph he had read 3 times over because the author had managed to perfectly articulate a feeling that he himself had never found the exact right words for. She took the book, her fingers brushing his, and promised she would read it. That night, sitting in her bed under the glow of the lamp, she turned to the marked page. It was a passage about the profound silence that exists between people. It described how the silence shared between two specific souls can be incredibly full, much louder and richer than the frantic noise shared between others, and how the narrator had finally realized that this heavy, comfortable silence was the truest definition of intimacy. She sat completely motionless, staring at that paragraph for a long time, the kerosene lamp flickering over the page and the summer wind rustling the apple tree outside. And she felt something massive and tectonic shift deep inside her chest, something she decidedly preferred not to name out loud just yet. On another afternoon, while leaning against the doorframe, he casually mentioned that he had accepted a massive contract. A wealthy landowner up north in Springfield was constructing a sprawling new estate, and he needed a master woodworker to handle all the intricate interior finishing. It was months of guaranteed, highly lucrative work, the kind of rare opportunity that didn't cross a tradesman's desk every year. He had signed the contract. He would be leaving in early August, and he expected the job to keep him up north for at least 3 months, possibly longer if the work demanded it. Livia forced her voice to remain perfectly, horrifyingly even, as she told him that it sounded like a wonderful opportunity. He nodded, his eyes searching her face, and said that it was, that the money would be a great help, and that he genuinely loved sinking his teeth into larger, more complex projects, that there was something about the sheer scale of a massive undertaking that pulled the absolute best out of him. She nodded mechanically and said she completely understood. He looked down at his boots, then back up at her, and said, his voice dropping a register, that he was going to miss their conversations. He said it simply, the way a man might comment on the changing weather, but the words hung suspended in the air between them, carrying a heavy, undeniable weight that his casual tone couldn't even begin to disguise. She swallowed hard, looking him in the eye, and told him that the conversations would still be right here, waiting for him whenever he got back. And the second the words left her mouth, she mildly regretted them, because they contained a devastating vulnerability she hadn't planned on exposing. She felt a sudden, traitorous heat flush her cheeks, which was incredibly rare for her. Tobias stared at her for a long, burning second, with that unnameable expression fully overtaking his features. Then a slow smile spread across his face, and he said softly that it was mighty good to know that. And then he tipped his hat and walked back toward his shop with his steady, grounded stride. Livia remained frozen in the doorway for a long time after he left, her hands twisting her work apron into knots, her eyes locked on the empty stretch of boardwalk where he had just been standing. The July sunset was painting the cobblestones a soft, bruised orange, and the sharp scent of burning pine from the evening suppers was drifting through the street. She stood there, completely still, for much, much longer than she had planned. Tobias left for Springfield in the second week of August. She knew he had gone because Beatrice casually mentioned it, using that overly breezy, forced casual tone that screams anything but casual. Beatrice noted that she had seen his loaded wagon rolling out of town down the North Road right at dawn. His heavy tools strapped tightly in the back, his hat pulled low against the rising sun. Livia kept her eyes glued to her needle and said, "Ah, so he's gone then." Beatrice watched her for a second and replied, "Yes, he's gone." And neither woman uttered another syllable about it for the rest of the day, which, in the complex language of female friendship, was an entire, sweeping conversation all on its own. Those first few weeks without the doorway, conversations felt horribly unbalanced, in a way that took Livia quite some time to admit to herself. It wasn't exactly that she missed him, or rather, it was the terrifying realization that there was suddenly a gaping void to be missed, which was an entirely different and far more dangerous revelation. Tobias's quiet presence had woven itself so seamlessly into the daily rhythm of her life that she hadn't even fully registered the depth of the roots while they were growing. He had never once demanded her attention, had never forcefully inserted himself in a way that required constant, exhausting maintenance. And that, she slowly began to understand during those long, quiet August afternoons filled with silk thread and the suffocating silence of the shop, was precisely the point. Tobias had never asked her for a single thing. He had never run the cold calculations, had never paraded his credentials like a peacock, had never even attempted to declare his intentions with grand, sweeping words, because there was something woven into the very fabric of the man that firmly believed consistent, undeniable presence was more than enough. He believed that showing up day after day was a language that the right person would eventually learn how to read, and she was reading it, loud and clear. The dressmaker's shop possessed a heavy silence on those August mornings, a silence she used to find wonderfully productive, but which now carried a distinctly hollow quality. It felt as though the silence itself was acutely aware that a vital piece of the room was missing. The front door that he had painstakingly planed and sanded now opened and closed with a perfect buttery smoothness that she had entirely stopped noticing because she had grown so used to it. Now, there were mornings when she would push that door open and instantly think of him without wanting to, his memory flashing through her mind like a rough sketch she wasn't entirely ready to look at. Beatrice tracked the emotional state of affairs with the terrifying precision of a woman who has known someone for 2 decades and can expertly translate their silences. She kept dropping by the shop with her usual regularity, but there was a distinct, protective gentleness to her visits now. She circled the unspoken topic with extreme caution, like a seasoned farmer who knows a piece of fruit is still green, and that trying to force it off the branch will only ruin the taste. She brought the expensive coffee when it arrived on the train. She spun hilarious tales about the town council to make Livia smile, and occasionally, just very occasionally, she would casually drop a crumb of news she had intercepted about the Springfield estate. That the framing was going spectacularly well, that the wealthy landowner was absolutely thrilled with the craftsmanship, that Tobias was exactly the kind of man who delivered brilliant work ahead of schedule. Livia would listen, nod, murmur that it was wonderful news, and bury her eyes back in her embroidery, but she meticulously gathered every single one of those tiny crumbs, hoarding them with a fierce desperation that she knew was entirely too revealing. On the darkest nights of August, when the Midwestern chill forced the windows shut and the kerosene lamp bathed her bedroom in a golden, almost theatrical light, Livia would sit with the books he had loaned her. The ones she had already returned, but had gone out and purchased copies of for herself. She read them, and she thought. She thought obsessively about the paragraph he had marked about the heavy silence between 2 souls. She analyzed the exact timbre of his voice when he had confessed he was going to miss their talks. She replayed the memory of the town festival, dissecting that suspended second when they had stood entirely too close together, and the undeniable fact that neither of them had instinctively pulled away. And she thought, with a brutal, stripping honesty that his physical absence made slightly easier to bear, about herself. She thought about the cursed week in March, about the 3 men, about the terrible question the universe had hurled at her 3 consecutive times, and how she had spent the entire time desperately trying to answer it using the wrong damn grading rubric. She had been trying to prove she was sufficient for other people, trying to ensure she weighed enough on the cold brass scales of other people's ledgers. But over the months since March, something profound had been quietly depositing itself inside her bones, building up so slowly that she could only fully witness the sheer scale of the change by looking backward, like a climber who scales a brutal mountain face and only realizes how impossibly high they've climbed when they finally stop and turn around to look at the valley below. The quiet doorway conversations that never once judged or evaluated her. The novels that aggressively reminded her that the world was infinitely larger and more complex than Willow Creek, and its suffocating opinions on family surnames and bank balances. The old apple tree in the yard, which had stubbornly borne sweet fruit in July exactly as it did every single year, utterly indifferent to the town's gossip. Her mother, sitting on the porch like an unshakable sentinel. The undeniable concrete fact that she produced the finest, most breathtaking embroidery in the entire county, and the fierce pride in knowing that she was the one whose hands created that beauty. Brick by tiny brick, without ever realizing she was laying a foundation, she had built a fortress. But it wasn't the kind of foundation those three men had arrogantly searched for and deemed insufficient. This was an entirely different kind of bedrock, an internal one. It couldn't be quantified in the town clerk's ledgers or verified by the bank manager in Chicago. It was the fierce, unshakable knowing of exactly who you are when the doors are locked and nobody is watching, when the external ledgers are burned. It was knowing the exact names of your own blooming flowers, understanding the true weight of your own silk thread, and recognizing the undeniable value of the work of your own two hands, because you know your own soul, and your soul knows you right back. In September, she accepted a massive new commission that completely stunned her with its sheer scale. A wealthy society matron from Chicago, who had been visiting her cousin in Willow Creek, had spotted one of Livia's embroidered tapestries hanging on her cousin's parlor wall. The woman had demanded to know who created it, wrote down Livia's name, and immediately drafted a formal letter commissioning a massive, intricate piece for the grand entryway of her Chicago mansion. It was the largest, most lucrative order Livia had received in years, perhaps the largest of her entire life. She spent an entire feverish weekend hunched over her work table, drafting the grand composition on a massive sheet of butcher paper, wildly testing color palettes, sketching and erasing and sketching again. She barely slept, yet she woke up on Monday morning vibrating with more raw, creative energy than she had felt in months. It was exactly this kind of triumph that forcefully reminded her, in a visceral way that completely bypassed the need for words, that she possessed a blazing fire inside of her that belonged to her and to her alone. A fire that absolutely did not require a man's permission or validation to burn brightly. Livia slowly digested this monumental truth throughout August and September, stitching furiously by day and analyzing her heart by night. And she came to realize the staggering, beautiful difference between the shattered woman who had stood trembling by the window, staring blindly at the apple tree back in March, and the woman she had become now, as October rolled in with its biting morning frosts and generous golden afternoons. The woman in March had desperately asked the universe, "Am I enough for them?" The woman in October had finally arrived, through blood and sweat and tears, at the only answer that mattered. I am enough for me. In mid-October, Beatrice practically kicked the shop door open one morning, wearing the manic look of a woman holding onto a piece of explosive news that was burning a hole in her tongue. She blurted out that she had just heard down at the Mercantile that the grand project in Springfield had wrapped up weeks ahead of schedule. The wealthy landowner had been so ecstatic with the craftsmanship that he had offered a massive bonus to keep the woodworker on for an additional wing, but Tobias had respectfully declined. He had told the man that he had urgent, unfinished business to attend to back in Willow Creek. He was expected back in town by the end of the week. Livia's heart slammed against her ribs. She forced her face to remain entirely blank and said, "Ah?" Beatrice stared at her and said, "Yes, ah?" And then Beatrice added, with a sickeningly calculated nonchalance, that she found that specific detail, the part about having urgent business in Willow Creek, fascinating. Because as far as Beatrice knew, the man had absolutely no family to care for. His house was locked up tight, and his usual local clients could certainly wait a month for a cabinet repair. Livia looked at Beatrice with the deeply unconvincing expression of a woman pretending she had no idea what her best friend was implying, and stated coldly that it was merely idle town gossip. Beatrice flashed a smile, full of sharp teeth, and said, "Of course it is, darling. Just gossip." Tobias rode back into Willow Creek on a Thursday afternoon. His wagon was significantly heavier than when he had left, loaded down with stacks of premium rich heartland cherry wood he had sourced up north, the exact kind of tight-grained timber he favored for his most delicate, intricate pieces. Livia knew the exact hour he arrived because Beatrice had ruthlessly dispatched the errand boy from the general store to deliver a folded slip of paper to the shop. It contained a single, hastily scribbled line: "He's back today." Nothing more. It was a staggering display of merciful restraint by Beatrice's usual dramatic standards. Livia spent the entire remainder of that Thursday afternoon huddled over the Chicago matron's massive tapestry, projecting a level of intense, furious concentration that, technically speaking, should have resulted in her finest work yet. But practically speaking, her productivity was abysmal, because absolutely every ounce of her mental capacity was focused elsewhere. It wasn't exactly anxiety coursing through her veins. It felt far more like the electric anticipation of an eve, that specific, crackling tension right before water hits a rolling boil. The tiny, uncontrollable tremor before the entire world completely changes its state. Late the next afternoon, she heard the heavy measured boots on the boardwalk. The golden October sunlight was pouring through the back window, bathing the shop in that generous, fleeting autumn warmth that sometimes blesses the earth right before the brutal winter locks everything in ice. The rich, familiar scent of raw cedar and sharp wood varnish, a scent her brain had permanently mapped to the existence of Tobias Hayes, drifted through the open door a full second before he even knocked. When his knuckles rapped gently on the doorframe and she called out for him to enter, he stepped inside. He was holding his hat in his hands, projecting that same quiet, unshakable stillness as always. But there was something decidedly new burning in his eyes. Or perhaps it wasn't new at all, and she was simply allowing herself for the very first time the terrifying courage to clearly see what had always been there. He cleared his throat and mentioned he had returned yesterday. She kept her voice painfully steady and told him she knew that Beatrice had sent word. He nodded slowly, a half-smile playing on his lips that was equal parts deeply amused and something vastly heavier, and said, "Ah." He told her he was doing well, that the Springfield job had been a massive success, that the northern estates were undeniably beautiful, but that there was a highly specific something in Willow Creek that Springfield simply did not have. Livia swallowed hard. She looked at him and asked what that was. Tobias locked his eyes onto hers with a piercing frontal directness she wasn't entirely accustomed to, because his style was always lateral, never this devastatingly direct. And he said, his voice dropping low in the quiet room, "The conversations in the doorway." Livia felt a furious, blinding heat rush into her cheeks for the second time in her entire adult life. She desperately tried to deflect, stammering that the conversations had lost an incredibly reliable handyman while he was gone. Tobias stepped closer. He said he was acutely aware of that. He confessed that during his first grueling week in Springfield, he had caught himself pacing the floorboards twice, convinced he had forgotten to check something critically important back in Willow Creek, before the brutal realization hit him that what he was missing wasn't a broken window shutter. A heavy silence fell over the shop then, not an awkward, scrambling silence, but a silence with terrifying mass and temperature, like the suffocating, electrified air right before a Midwestern tornado touches down. Tobias looked at her with the quiet, intense gravity he reserved for things that truly mattered to his soul, the exact same gravity he used when dissecting the literature they shared. He said he needed to be completely honest about something. He said he knew this wasn't the simplest time, that she absolutely didn't owe a single explanation or piece of her heart to anyone, and he respected that deeply. But he said he had spent 3 agonizing months away with far too much time alone with his thoughts, and he had reached the unshakable conclusion that the things a man leaves unsaid end up costing him far more than the things he says poorly. He told her he had admired her for a very long time. Not in a vague, passing way, but in a fiercely specific way. He said he could list exactly why, if she ever needed him to, and he said that if she believed it was something worth considering, he would very much like, if she would grant him the honor, to continue being the man she saw when she opened her shop every morning, the man who was right there the second a hinge broke. And the man who thought of her the second he found a beautiful paragraph in a book that matched the brilliant way her mind worked. He delivered the entire speech without rushing a single syllable, with the exact same serene grounding he used to discuss the weather or timber grades, but there was a bedrock of absolute, unyielding firmness beneath the words that gave them exactly the right amount of devastating weight. It did not sound like a rehearsed performance. It sounded exactly like a man who had spent months painstakingly carving out a massive truth inside his own chest, and when the moment finally arrived, realized he knew the exact shape of it. Livia sat frozen, staring up at him, the massive embroidery hoop resting dead in her lap, her usually nimble hands completely paralyzed, and in that suspended, breathless second, her mind flashed violently back to March. She thought of the 3 men who had coldly run their calculations and arrived at numbers that deemed her worthless. She thought of the clerk's office, the brutal sale of the apothecary, the mountain of debts she had systematically slaughtered, and the grueling months of silent, agonizing reconstruction. She thought of the little leather-bound book, forever marked on the page about the heavy silence between 2 souls. She thought of every single golden afternoon spent talking on the threshold, and how profoundly different it had felt. Different in a terrifying way she had fought tooth and nail to deny, because the world had brutally trained her to distrust anything that felt too good. And then a memory surfaced. Something Beatrice had casually tossed out weeks ago over cups of coffee in the back of the Mercantile. Beatrice had said, her voice unusually soft, "The kind of love that's actually worth a damn doesn't kick the door down and demand you prove you deserve it. It walks right in because it already knows exactly who you are." Livia very slowly, very deliberately, lifted the massive embroidery hoop and set it down on the work table. She raised her face to meet Tobias's eyes, wearing an expression that he instantly recognized as entirely unprecedented. The polite, bulletproof armor she constantly wore was completely gone. The icy, intellectual distance that foolish men confused with arrogance had vanished. There was only Livia, entirely stripped down and whole, looking at him with her father's dark, piercing eyes, her mother's stubbornly raised chin, and all that brilliant, terrifying intelligence blazing freely, an intelligence that had never been a flaw, never a burden, never a single ounce less than magnificent. She took a slow breath and told him that she had done an awful lot of thinking over the last several months, that she had arrived at some incredibly hard-won conclusions that she probably never would have reached if the last year hadn't broken her exactly the way it did, including the parts that nearly destroyed her. She said she had finally learned, in the brutal way that only life can teach and books never can, that being sufficient for herself was the absolute only measure of sufficiency that actually mattered. And she said that because she finally truly believed that in her bones she was able to look at him standing right here, right now, without an ounce of fear that she needed to pretend to be anything other than exactly who she was. She told him that she firmly believed the conversations they shared in the doorway were the finest she had experienced in years. She confessed that the little book with the marked page was currently sitting on her nightstand, and that she had read that specific paragraph far more times than she would ever publicly admit. And then she looked him dead in the eye, and she said, "Yes." Tobias went completely, absolutely still for a long second. Then, that devastating half-smile finally broke across his face. The genuine, unguarded smile she had learned to recognize as authentic in a way that calculated charm never could be. He let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for months, and confessed that the week in Springfield, when he finally realized exactly what he was missing, had been the longest, most agonizing week of his entire life, considering he was swinging a hammer from dawn till dusk to try and ignore it. She laughed, a real, full laugh. He laughed right back with her. And that shared laughter ringing out in the quiet shop was the exact thing that finally untied the massive, suffocating knots that both of them had been carrying in their shoulders for far too long. Tobias lingered on the threshold of the shop that afternoon much longer than he ever had before. They talked about the grand estates in Springfield. They debated the ending of a new novel. They discussed his plans to completely renovate his farmhouse come the spring thaw. And he marveled at the staggering beauty of the Chicago matron's tapestry. When the sun finally began to dip below the horizon and the biting October chill crept through the open door, he softly said that she shouldn't catch a cold, that she had a masterpiece to finish, and that he would drop by first thing tomorrow morning if she didn't mind. She smiled softly and told him she wouldn't mind at all. He stepped out onto the boardwalk. She slowly closed the heavy door, the very same door he had fixed back in the dead of February, and leaned her back against the solid wood for a long moment, closing her eyes. The shop was filled with the intoxicating scent of raw cedar, sharp varnish, and silk thread. And blooming fiercely inside her chest was a massive, sweeping sensation that she finally recognized after an eternity of darkness as pure lightness. Not a cheap, easy lightness. Not the kind of naive joy that has never known the crushing weight of sorrow. This was the profound, earned lightness that only arrives after you have carried the heaviest stone up the mountain, set it down, and realized that the brutal climb was actually building your muscles for something far greater. She realized, leaning against that door, that the three men from March, without ever having a single clue what they were doing, had ruthlessly forged the exact woman standing in this shop today. A woman leaning against a perfectly fixed door, her heart incredibly quiet and impossibly full. And here, my dear listeners of Tales of Yesteryear, we must pause for a moment. If this profound story is reaching you in a way that makes sense, if it resonates somewhere deep inside your own journey, leave a comment below and tell me what you are feeling. This channel exists entirely because of you, and every single comment, every shared story, every like is the fuel that keeps us here, bringing these timeless tales to light. Now, stay with me, because we are finally reaching the most beautiful part of all. The months that followed possessed a luminous quality entirely distinct from anything that had come before. Not because they were a flawless fairy tale, life in Willow Creek remained exactly what it had always been, with its petty grievances, its mundane struggles, a brutal winter that arrived in December, freezing the wells solid, delayed shipments of silk thread, and ledgers that still required meticulous balancing. But there was a vibrantly different color painted over everything. Livia couldn't articulate it any other way, except to say that there was brilliant color where there used to be endless gray. The world itself hadn't miraculously changed. She was simply viewing it from a vastly superior angle. Tobias would stop by the shop every single morning when his work brought him to the west side of town. They kept exchanging books. Only now, the handoffs occurred during long, winding walks through the streets of Willow Creek on the milder afternoons, when he would lock up his woodshop early, and she had completed her stitching quota for the day. He had a beautiful habit of pointing out hidden details during these walks, the complex grain of weathered timber on an old barn, a pine tree that had been bent nearly in half by a storm but had stubbornly fought its way back toward the sun. Or a window frame he had hand-carved a decade ago that still held perfectly true. She had a habit of inventing elaborate, sweeping backstories for the strangers passing by on wagons. Just a quick, brilliant sentence or two about where they were rushing to and what secrets they carried. And he would listen with that rapt, devoted attention he reserved for things he found utterly mesmerizing. Sometimes he would join in and build the stories with her. And there was something profoundly intimate in those moments of shared invention. That tiny, private complicity of looking at the exact same mundane world and choosing to imagine magic together, that she found far more devastatingly romantic than any grand, poetic declaration could ever be. A deep, rooted tenderness grew between them, expanding slowly and steadily, much like the rings of the hardwood he worked with, requiring immense patience and time. It wasn't a violent, destructive passion. It was infinitely deeper than mere infatuation. It was the rare, indestructible kind of affection that you only recognize by its unwavering consistency, by the breathtaking ease of being allowed to exist exactly as you are without running a single calculation, by the quiet, mounting certainty that slowly builds in your bones, telling you that this man is the solid ground where you finally want to plant your roots and stay. There were late afternoons when he would arrive carrying something he had crafted from the scrap wood at his shop, a small, perfectly sanded keepsake box, an intricate needle case lined with velvet, or a block of heartland cherry carved so smoothly it felt like silk against the palm. He would hand them to her without an ounce of ceremony, simply muttering that it was leftover timber, and he figured she might find a use for it. She hoarded every single one of those wooden treasures. There was a profound, secret language locked inside those gestures, a private dialect belonging only to the two of them, a way of screaming, "I love you," without ever uttering the specific words that the town's rigid protocols demanded for courtship. Livia catalogued these memories with the exact same painstaking care she applied to her finest silk tapestries. The golden afternoon they walked near the old mill pond at the edge of town, and he stopped to point out the perfect mirror reflection of the pine trees in the still water, murmuring that there were some rare things in this world that aligned so perfectly they absolutely defied explanation. She knew, without him needing to spell it out, that he was talking about them. The stormy Sunday in August, when the rain hammered down relentlessly, and she was trapped in the shop frantically trying to catch up on a delayed order, and he miraculously appeared carrying a loaf of fresh-baked cornbread straight from his oven. It was the very first time she learned he knew how to bake. They spent the entire afternoon holed up in the back of the shop, the rain deafening against the tin roof, the air thick with the scent of hot bread and melting butter, neither of them possessing a single ounce of urgency for the storm to pass. The crisp September night there was a barn dance out at the Grange Hall, and he formally asked to escort her, employing that soft, devastating seriousness he reserved for momentous occasions. When they walked through the double doors together, Beatrice flashed a grin so massive and triumphant that Albert stopped pouring cider to ask his wife what on earth she was scheming. Eleanor had watched this entire romance unfold with the highly specific, intoxicating blend of profound relief and overwhelming joy that only a mother experiences when she realizes her fiercely independent child has finally found something undeniably real. She rarely offered commentary, having long ago learned that Livia required vast, silent expanses of space to reach her own conclusions. But one late afternoon, while sitting on the porch drinking coffee, shortly after Tobias had dropped off the hot cornbread and headed back to his shop, Livia returned to her embroidery wearing a soft, absent-minded smile she likely had no idea was resting on her face. Eleanor took a slow sip from her mug and stated very quietly into the autumn air that Arthur Vance would have liked Tobias Hayes an awful lot. Livia froze. She slowly lifted her eyes to meet her mother's, holding the gaze for a long, heavy second, and then softly replied that she knew, that she had been thinking the exact same thing. The two women sat in the fading light for a long time, sipping their coffee, staring out at their respective corners of the yard. And in that heavy silence, there was a profound sense of gratitude, not directed at one another, but directed upward, at whatever grand, unnamed force had finally set the world right. The remaining debts were entirely eradicated that winter. The embroidery shop had exploded in popularity, generating enough revenue that Livia was able to hire an apprentice, a bright young girl named Roseanne, who possessed nimble fingers and an insatiable hunger to learn. The Vance surname, which had momentarily lost its heavy anchor in the town's social ledger during the dark years, slowly regained its substance. But it was a vastly different kind of substance now. It was no longer the inherited weight of the grand apothecary or her father's respected title. It was a weight she had forged entirely by herself, built with her own two bleeding hands, devoid of inheritance and utterly free of debt. Willow Creek, being the kind of town that meticulously hoards every memory, quietly archived the image of the two of them walking side by side down the dirt roads. They noted the shop door that was permanently propped open on sunny days, and the endless rotation of leather-bound books that passed between them like precious gifts that required no wrapping paper. The townsfolk who watched them together, and later watched them moving through the world independently when work demanded it, were struck by that highly specific, comforting sensation that only truly beautiful stories can provide. The profound reassurance that there is, in fact, order in the universe, that sometimes, against all odds, the pieces finally click into the exact right places, no matter how long the journey takes. In the early thaw of 1926, Tobias formally asked Eleanor for Livia's hand in marriage. It was a Saturday afternoon, and he sat stiffly in the parlor of the brick house on Commercial Street, his hat resting in his lap, his large, calloused hands resting perfectly still on top of the brim. He had meticulously rehearsed exactly what he intended to say, a fact Livia only discovered much later, when he bashfully confessed that he had practiced the speech out loud to his empty barn more than once. The confession had shocked and moved her to tears in a way she never anticipated, because she had never associated a man as solidly grounded as Tobias with the terrifying vulnerability of needing to practice his words. It made her realize, with staggering clarity, exactly how much this moment meant to him. Eleanor beamed and said yes, with such blinding speed that all three of them burst out laughing. Then she immediately leaped up, declaring that she had been praying for this exact conversation for a year and a half, and scurried off to the cellar to fetch the blackberry wine she had been aggressively hoarding since Christmas for a momentous occasion. The wedding took place in April of that same year. It was an intimate affair, held in the little stone church with the ancient bell that creaked heavily before ringing its joyous peal across the valley. The wooden pews were adorned with wild spring prairie flowers, painstakingly gathered by Beatrice, who had hauled herself out of bed before dawn to beat the morning frost to the fields. Reverend Evans officiated the ceremony, wielding that warm, measured humor that was his absolute signature whenever he was marrying a couple he genuinely adored. The reception was held out at Tobias's farmhouse, which was now their farmhouse. There was a massive feast of slow-roasted beef, fresh-baked pies, and endless coffee poured in the late afternoon sun, which cast long golden shadows across the brand-new wraparound wooden porch he had built specifically for her arrival. The porch had taken an entire month to construct. He had worked on it by lantern light in the freezing hours before dawn to ensure every board was perfectly laid before her wedding day. When Livia stepped out of the wagon and laid eyes on her new home for the very first time, seeing that sweeping porch with the wood still smelling faintly of fresh varnish, she froze in the dirt. She stood completely paralyzed, staring at it, her throat so tight she couldn't formulate a single word. Livia walked down the aisle in a gown of heavy white silk that she had spent 3 agonizing months embroidering herself. It was, unequivocally, the most masterful, excruciatingly detailed needlework she had ever executed in her entire life. The sleeves were a sprawling tapestry of wild prairie flowers, woven with microscopic threads of spun silver, completely invisible from the back pews, but undeniably brilliant to anyone who stood close enough to truly see her. It was exactly the kind of detail she needed to know was there, not to impress the town, but to honor herself. The years that followed were precisely the kind of years that follow when two fiercely capable people decide to build something together that is infinitely larger than the sum of their parts. Tobias expanded the woodworking shop, taking on massive architectural contracts in neighboring cities, though he never stayed away for long, only as much as the timber required. Livia knocked down a wall, expanded the shop, and began formally teaching the art of embroidery to the young women of the county. She discovered that passing her hard-won skills from her hands into theirs was nearly as intoxicatingly satisfying as the stitching itself. The farmhouse flourished wildly under their combined care. As the decades rolled on, a profound, unbreakable complicity settled over them. A fortress built entirely of late-night conversations, comfortable silences, shared novels, evening walks, and inevitable disagreements that were always navigated with grueling patience. It was the kind of deep-rooted complicity that doesn't need to be shouted from the rooftops, but is instantly visible in the seamless way two bodies navigate the exact same space, moving with an effortless, synchronized grace, as if they had always been spinning on the exact same axis. Many years later, during a lazy afternoon drinking coffee in the back room of the Mercantile, Beatrice suddenly spoke up. She noted that there was something highly specific about the way Tobias looked at Livia, a look she had never, ever witnessed between any other married couple in the entire history of Willow Creek. Livia paused, her coffee cup halfway to her mouth, and asked what she meant. Beatrice smiled softly and said it was the simple fact that his gaze had never, ever shifted. That from the very first afternoon she had caught him staring back in the era of the broken shutters and doorway chats, the look in his eyes remained exactly the same. It was a gaze of total, unshakable, peaceful devotion. A look that said she was, without a shadow of a doubt, the most fascinating creature in the entire room. And he didn't feel the need to loudly declare it, aggressively prove it, or run a single calculation to justify it. Livia went very quiet for a long time. Finally, she set her cup down and whispered that she knew. She said it was exactly that specific, uncalculated gaze that had taken her so horribly long to finally understand. But when she did understand it, she absorbed it with the terrifying certainty that accompanies only the most profound truths. She hadn't understood it with her logical brain first. She had understood it with the bruised, battered place deep down in her gut, where the heavy truths patiently wait for us to grow strong enough to finally carry them. The three ghosts of March 1924 carried on with their respective lives. Richard Anderson married a wealthy cattle rancher's daughter from out west and moved away to the plains. Dr. Pendleton remained the town's physician for another austere decade before retiring to a grand estate in Chicago. Ernest Sullivan and his lovely Leonora opened a highly successful second mercantile branch in Oak Ridge. They all lived their lives the way people do, accumulating their triumphs and their regrets, gathering the memories that settle like heavy stones at the bottom of the riverbed. None of those three men ever truly knew, not for a single second of their lives, the sheer magnitude of the gift they had handed Livia Vance the day they told her no. Not because she was ever insufficient, but because their blind, foolish rejection had violently cleared the path for the one man on earth who always knew the exact answer to her worth without ever needing to ask the question. Tobias Hayes, the master woodworker of Willow Creek. A towering man with calloused hands, a grounded stride, and a gaze that completely refused to run the cruel arithmetic of the world. He had known her worth from the very first afternoon. He had known it the second he walked in with a piece of sandpaper to fix a jammed door and found a woman hunched over her embroidery, attacking her craft with the fierce intensity of someone who pours their entire soul into everything they touch. He had known it through every doorway conversation, every leather-bound book they shared, and every step they took under that shared umbrella in the pouring rain. He had known it during those agonizing 3 months up north, when he realized with terrifying clarity that the gaping hole in his life wasn't a broken window. And there came a day, many, many years after they had spoken their vows, on a freezing winter afternoon with the prairie grass encased in thick ice and the smoke lazily drifting from the farmhouse chimney. Livia was sitting in her rocking chair by the roaring hearth, meticulously stitching a new tapestry. Tobias was standing at his heavy workbench in the shop that was attached to the other side of the wall. She paused her needle for a moment, letting the room fall silent, and she listened to the rhythmic, sweeping sound of his heavy iron-wood plane. That distinct, powerful sound of sharp steel shaving long, perfect ribbons off a slab of raw cherry wood. And as she listened to the rhythm of her husband's hands, she thought back to the terrifying question the universe had violently hurled at her 3 times back in March of 1924, and how agonizingly long it had taken her to find the right answer. The question was, do you know what you are worth? And the answer was, yes. It had always been yes. She had simply needed a brutal winter, a few good books, a heavy wooden door fixed free of charge, and a fiercely quiet man who never once needed to be convinced of her value to finally remember it. She carefully rested her embroidery hoop in her lap. She stood up, walked over to the heavy door that separated the parlor from the woodshop, pushed it open, and softly called his name. Tobias instantly stopped his plane and lifted his eyes from the timber. He looked at her with that exact same gaze, the identical, unshakable look he had given her 15 years ago when he was fixing her shutters in the April rain. She smiled and told him she was brewing a fresh pot of coffee and asked if he wanted a cup. He smiled that slow, devastating half-smile and told her he absolutely did, that he'd be right in as soon as he finished sanding this edge. She told him that was perfectly fine. There was absolutely no rush. The coffee would wait. She closed the door gently and walked back toward the kitchen, wearing a brilliant, triumphant smile that belonged entirely to her, the kind of smile that requires absolutely no witnesses to be real. Outside the frosted window panes, the old willow trees swayed gracefully in the biting Midwestern wind, their slender branches glittering violently with the morning ice, as if the autumn had stubbornly decided just one more time to stay exactly where it was.